have this new information about compassion and mindfulness and all that, and we are still trying to figure out how does that look, and that's okay. In this video, we're going to cover post-traumatic growth and how it's more likely than PTSD, how to put boundaries around compassion, toxic positivity, what the acronym VUCA stands for, your best trauma tool, the key aspect of empowerment, and the role of curiosity in the fight and flight response, plus much more. It's a great interview with Dr. Christopher Willard. He is a clinical psychologist, author, and consultant based in Massachusetts. He also teaches at Harvard Medical School. He's the author of 20 books, and today we're going to be talking about how we grow through what we go through. This book was so great for me when I was writing book 2, and I was looking at post-traumatic growth and resiliency. It came along at the perfect time. And so I was just curious about why you went in that direction of post-traumatic growth and how you see it, how you define that.
For me, where that book came from was in the midst of the pandemic. I had been, before the pandemic, talking about mindfulness and self-regulation and all these other topics and doing a lot of consulting in schools. And then everything just totally shut down. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm never going to work again. I'm going to be unemployed, right? How's this going to happen? Canceling plane tickets, all kinds of things like that. And then suddenly, be this like wave of, will you talk about resilience? Will you talk about mental health? Will you talk about trauma? And a few things happened. One was when I started researching a bit about trauma, finding that this sort of amazing stuff around the likelihood after trauma of post-traumatic growth is actually more likely than the likelihood of post-traumatic stress, although the two actually can co-occur at the same time, which is actually quite amazing and inspiring. And everything was just such a bummer during the pandemic. I really wanted to kind of remind people of, we've been through hard things as a species. We've been through hard things as individuals. We can grow through this, and let's look at what are the conditions under which this is likely to happen, and to try to do that in a way that wasn't also kind of contributing to the problem of toxic positivity of every cloud has to have a silver lining, or every bad thing has to happen for a reason that you better find to get better. And that may or may not be true, but we should certainly look for meaning behind things, and we should certainly look for opportunities to grow and do that in a way that's also not shaming to people that don't feel like they are growing, but also to point out to people that they're probably growing more than they're aware of, and also to help them grow in the right way. This idea of like people are going to grow no matter what, and change no matter what. How do we help them grow and change in a way that's productive to them and to the people around them?
There's this sense that we are dwelling kind of on the after effects of the pandemic. And I like the timing of the book because I feel like we need to see our students as resilient more so than as victims of trauma. It feels like we've gotten a little bit tied up into the trauma of it all. I'm going to read from your book. I love the size of this book.
That's so intimidating.
No, it's just lovely. And I love the cover. You said we can't understand each other's pain fully, but we can recognize and witness it in each other. Not to fix it or ask it to be fixed, not to try to fix ourselves, but to be with and witness our pain. And I was curious how you see that in schools. How can we be with in classrooms when it just seems like there's a lot of uncertainty, unpredictability, and a lot of chaos right now in schools? Yeah. How does that feel for a teacher to just feel like that's okay, that that's enough?
As a society, as a planet, as communities, and as individuals and as families, oftentimes too. Many of us find ourselves in and out of a kind of VUCA situation. That also does come back together too. And I do feel really strongly that, as Leanna says, this, the gift is in the offering. To me, that's about, we can't lead a horse to water, and, whatever you might say in Texas and in the Southwest where you are too, Deb. But this idea of just as a parent, right, sort of back to Winnicott, like being a good enough mother, being a good enough parent, right? And being a good enough friend, being a good enough therapist, a good enough teacher, that when we are offering and making ourselves available as an attachment object. We're not forcing an attachment, but we are there to be attached to when that person is ready to make that attachment, to make that connection, to do that healing. This actually just came up in conversation with a client right before I got on with the two of you. But this, he was saying, why is it that you don't give me advice? My friend just gave me this really great rundown of my whole psyche, and it was so mind-blowing. Why don't you do that, Dr. Chris? And I was like, well, I always feel like as a therapist, if I give you too much advice or give you too much of a formulation of yourself, someday it might land perfectly, but some days it might not. And my job is to create the conditions under which you then someday draw a conclusion yourself, and then it will stick with you in the longer term than if I just hand it to you. It's again sort of teach a person to fish kind of thing also, if you look at that angle on it. So to me, I think that's so much of what it's about, and that just having that witnessing that authentic human connection, we know on so many levels, unconditional positive regard, selfless love, unconditional love, trying to channel the love of a higher power, right? All of that is what heals us as human beings, whether we're spiritual or secular. The science backs that up, as well as thousands of years of human existence. And so I do believe in just bearing witness compassionately is so much, and that is the most incredible offering we can make.
Well, it's a beautiful thing because I think what you're referring to is that the agendaless presence, as Dr. Bonnie Badenoch calls it,
Hmm.
and the witnessing, I believe, is a bridge to true self-reflection that creates new neural pathways,
Yeah.
right? It's like if it's just given or it's stated or a lecture, we miss that right brain to right brain, nervous system to nervous system connection that truly brings that true transformation.
It's relational, it's moving, it's
Yes,
embodied. It's not, here's a curriculum and I think we have to live it,
right.
just read it, and certainly not as educators to read it out loud. It's so much more
With
than
a script. With
Yes,
a
that. Right.
script. This is just a conversation. Like in
right.
a classroom, we're having a conversation with our students about this rather than this is the curriculum. But schools are set up for that whole curriculum kind of approach. What are our goals and what are our objectives? But I feel like being present, and I'd like your input on that. When you talk about being mindful or present in the classroom, how does that relate to following a very strict curriculum on resilience or trauma informed or, whatever curriculum's out there?
Yeah, this has become a bit of a line for me as I get asked to do talks on trauma, and I think there is such a wonderful moment where we are deciding in schools to approach education with a trauma-informed lens, as we've approached psychotherapy. Hopefully, we've approached psychotherapy with that lens, but in education and a lot of desire for that. And I think two things are happening. One, when I talk to educators, there's a ton of anxiety of, I am doing this wrong. Am I going to trigger this child accidentally? Am I going to re-traumatize them? And what I say to educators who ask me that question is, if you're thoughtful enough to be asking me that question, you're probably not the educators I'm worried about or who need to be in this workshop. You might be, and hopefully you'll get some tips here, but you are going to be an ambassador toward a re-traumatizing system to other, teachers and educators in your school or in your district, or parents or other kind of community members who may be unwittingly doing that. And also with the kids, and people say, well, what do I do if a kid's traumatized? It's less about doing, and I think mindfulness would say in general, it's less about doing and more about being. It's who you are. Like the best trauma tool you have is yourself. It's your most well-regulated, empathic, and boundaried, not just empathic and compassionate, but compassionate and empathic within boundaries, self that you can be. That's the best trauma tool for that child. And all the resilience, of course, research backs it up. The one charismatic adult, this co-regulation, right? All of that. And so that's really where I like to start, is educating educators that they are themselves, when they embody a sense of self-regulation or a sense of offering themselves the gift of aspiring towards self-regulation, that they are then being a beacon, an ambassador toward the other educators in the building and toward the children in their classrooms and the children in their schools. You can hear my quasi-dysregulated daughter just got home from camp. Um, but but that's where we begin, I think, in particular.
When I asked you about your one thing quote for my book, Thank you for giving me your one thing quote. You said the one thing is you. If you want well-regulated, healthy, happy kids, you've got to surround them with well-regulated, healthy, happy adults. So what do you think are some steps forward in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think mindfulness is that. I think boundaries is that. I think that like we can't, we go into education because we want to educate every kid. We go into helping and healing folks like Leanna and myself because we want to save everybody. And yet also we have to realize what our boundaries are, and we can only save the person in the mirror, and then maybe the person in front of us, who often is the person in the mirror. But I think knowing our limits is also really important. And so I think that's a particular challenge for women who I think are often told to do more in that caregiving role than is often healthy for them, or that's expected of them to be self-sacrificing in certain ways and in certain kinds of hierarchical structures. And so to be taking good care of themselves in a way that's not that isn't self. I don't want to say it doesn't feel selfish, but just frankly isn't selfish. We have to take care of ourselves, and take care of our instruments. And if our most important tool is ourselves, then it's are we stopping answering emails after a certain hour? Are we eating well? Are we taking care of our friendships? Are we getting some degree of exercise? Are we getting rest for ourselves? Are we doing those things that actually do matter and giving ourselves a break? And exercising true self-care, which is not self-indulgence. I think these get really confused in our society. It's like, oh, self-care is I'm going to
Oh,
go
yeah.
shopping, or self-care is I'm going to go drink all this or eat all this. It's like, no, it's in between those. Sometimes it's indulging, and sometimes it's making sacrifices, but it's usually the middle path between those. And to me, we all have our own path, but to me, mindfulness has been really helpful for my own path toward self-care and self-regulation.
I love that response too, because it's oftentimes in the teaching profession, you're already a natural caregiver. And then you have children of your own, and you have families, and you have, aging parents, or wherever you are on this journey of development in life. And for me, I had to reframe that and be like, this is caring for my nervous system. So for me, because of just for so many reasons, self-care did feel selfish. It did feel like, my responsibility is to take care of everyone, make sure everything's okay first. And then, but then once I began to place it into, no, I actually have to care for my nervous system, because it's no one else's responsibility to care for my nervous system except for me.
In your book, you talk about attend and befriend. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, I know a lot of folks talk about, of course, the fight or flight response. And I think a lot of us are familiar with that in the nervous system. We're under threat, we fight or we flee, right? Logical, sort of.
Yeah.
I was in Texas last week, and I was joking. It's like, there's a tiger chasing. What do you want to do? In Texas, you shoot it, maybe, right? I don't know. But, elsewhere, maybe you either fight
Or
or you
lasso it. We could.
Well, I like that, Leanna. Much nicer frame. You lasso it, right? Right. Or you kind of freeze or flop, freeze
Yeah.
and fawn, right?
Yeah.
Another kind of response that we have. Freeze or, forget it or F it, or another F word you put in there. And then we also have, I think, people have talked about the tend and befriend, and I'm a believer in that too, but I believe also in like attend and befriend, like attend to others, right,
Mhm.
with compassion, and befriend ourselves. I think, right, if this is the fight or flight kind of posture, this is freeze or faint, right? We have attend, which is close
Yeah.
physiologically to mindfulness, and this is befriend, which is, giving ourselves what we need in this moment. In different situations really call for different responses. And I think even just enacting these different physical postures can actually help us understand our boundaries in different ways. It can help us see sometimes fight is what we need and flight is what we need. And sometimes actually, attending to the situation when we think through a problem and our body posture is like this, we actually have different solutions arise. When we think through a problem, an interpersonal challenge, and our posture is like this, very different words, solutions, responses arise. So that to me has become a really helpful exercise for myself when I'm feeling stuck, and one that I also share with clients. But it's also, I often like to say, I don't like to introduce the negative without also introducing, the good news too. And yeah, fight or flight, can be a problem, and freeze and faint, and we can put that certainly, into polyvagal language too, of course, but also attend and befriend,
Mhm.
right? These are also inverting that and are also really helpful, really healthy responses at the right moment. If a tiger's chasing you, befriend, maybe not. You discover it's not actually a tiger, it's a fluffy little cat. Yeah, befriend, attend. Like that's what we want. But that's often how I think of those different responses too.
Have you had any principals or administrators who are open to the attend and befriend? I picture a world where when teachers go into a principal's office and they're really stressed and they're in fight or flight, and
Hmm.
sometimes they end up just getting judged. Like sometimes it's about,
Mhm.
well, you need better management skills. You need, let's see what we can do to get you some help with your management skills. It like goes back to the teacher when
Yep.
they're in there looking for some support. And I
Right.
feel like that's maybe what we're missing and why teachers might be getting so burnt out is one teacher told me she went into the principal's office and she had done all these things with this student, and he was a chair thrower and he was really pretty violent in the classroom. And finally, she just had enough and she went in and he just said to her, "You need to be more compassionate."
Mm.
So I'm writing a book right now, a kid's book that I kind of want to call Kindness Sucks, even though kindness doesn't suck. But it's because like there's this like cultural moment where everyone's like
Mhm.
wearing be kind t-shirts and it's like, yes, of course we should be kind and compassionate, but it's freaking hard. Like it is so hard. Like how do we get there? And I think like just saying be more compassionate, it's like, I joke in my presentations, I'm like, it's as effective as saying calm down. Like it's like
Right.
no one ever calmed down by being told to calm down. No one was ever compassionate when we told them to. Certainly not my kids and or me, like my full disclosure. But I do feel like how do we learn how to self-regulate so that we can go from fight to befriend, that we can go from flight to attend, and it becomes a choice, right? Empowerment is having choice, right? Trauma is having no choice. Empowerment is having choice, right? And I think, enlightenment is having choice, right, in our lives and having enough choice in our lives. And when we can choose what our response is, and again, sort of all the mindfulness cliches around that, right? That's the most empowering thing. So to me, my question to the principal is like, how are you A, being compassionate by telling your teacher to do that? And B,
Mhm.
how are you empowering them and teaching them how
Mhm.
to be compassionate? Right, because again, it's the co-regulation starts with the principal and goes to the teacher, and the teacher also is getting it from the parents who are saying, "Fix my kid and make them behave and make them learn," and they're getting it then in the classroom when the kids throwing the desk. And one of the exercises I do is often, when people are in a good space, is I think like let's look underneath the behavior. My friends Nancy Rappaport and Jess Minahan do this work in what they call the behavior code. But things like what are three reasons why the child might be acting that way? And it can't be just because they're trying to ruin my lesson. But when we start to look at that compassionately, for like a few things happen. Like one is we calm down, two is we get some perspective, but three is the solution is more likely to arise. So if I do this in a workshop, I'll often say, think of that annoying kid. Don't think of the biggest, most annoying kid, but like, first of all, what are three things, you might have in common with them? You're both male, you're both from the same town, you both like the Red Sox, what are three things you admire about them? Like, okay, even if it's just like they've got good shoes or they've got, they like music, something like that. And then let's start to think a bit more deeply about, and I do this in supervision with people I work with. What are three reasons they might act that way? And like you think about a kid throwing a desk, it's like you don't have to be right. Maybe they're trying to break your desk and ruin your classroom, but three other reasons. And it's like maybe they're hungry because there's food insecurity at home, and so they're dysregulated. Maybe they're tired because they were caring for their drunk mom and they didn't know when she was going to get home last night. Maybe they were getting bullied on the bus, or they're afraid that those two kids sitting in front of them are talking about them. Those things may or may not be true, right? But what if we add those to the menu? To me, that's being trauma
Mhm.
aware, that's being trauma informed. And then what else happens is it's like, oh, so those three things, okay, so if they're hungry, maybe, okay, it really sucks that kids don't have food and that as a teacher I have to buy granola bars and keep them on my desk. But actually, that does make my life easier if I've got some granola bars on my desk and I can see if that kid needs something, right? I don't know if this kid's getting bullied or not, but maybe the seating plan isn't working out. Maybe I should, give them a note to go check in with the guidance counselor or check in with the bus monitor at the end of the day. Is there something else weird going on with this kid and these other kids?
Mm.
Maybe this kid, didn't get any sleep because they were watching out for their drunk mom. And maybe I can just say, what, today just put your head down on your desk and rest. Or here's a note if you want to go to the nurse's office and take a nap for the next class. And that's a compassionate response. And even if it's not one of those three things, what that does is it lowers the educator's arousal level into attend and befriend. It opens it up for more solutions. It might solve it. And then I invite them to do the more advanced thing, which is, the parent who's getting under your skin, the principal who's, really leaning down on you. What are three reasons they might be acting that way? When we feel in a safe place, maybe in a workshop or a PD or something, maybe not with the principal in the room, but with a group of educators, right? It really can be shifting and remind us of why we got into this profession, to help people and not just do classroom management. Does it fix everything? No. Does it fix it every time? No. But it refreshes some of our energy and inspires us. And sometimes it solves the problem. And then we don't have the learned helplessness if at least sometimes it helps. So
It's so timely because I think that element of curiosity and just that right there and saying what's the possibility begins to probably open up so much within our inner world and our brains to go, hey, how can I see this differently? And I think you're exactly right, where it's those choices, which again, Deborah, which is why your book, as the teacher and the educator, that you have them walk through these principles and these exercises and experiences that help them get to know their nervous system. Because if we, I'd like to say we can't practice a fire drill when the fire's here, right? Like we have to know what are our options beforehand. And I think that curiosity, and that discovery mindset is so critical to having choices.
And Leanna, you mentioned curiosity, and I don't know if you followed Joe Brewer's work. I just was listening to an interview with him. I haven't read his book yet, but I've heard him talk about curiosity in the brain shuts off the fight or flight response. It shuts off the anxiety response, like, which is so amazing how you can like watch it happen. And as educators, what's our job, right? Is it the filling of brains or is it the lighting of a fire? I can't remember, I'm misquoting, mangling the quote, but it's like, if it's the lighting of a fire, right? That's curiosity. How do we keep curiosity kindling so that they're curious about how do I answer this math problem? Like, why did this happen in history? What is the author trying to tell me? What do I want to learn about myself and my own behavior in a more SEL context? And I think promoting curiosity is the educator's fundamental job at some level. And if you're able to do that, as you're saying to Leanna, then you're also teaching them self-regulation, which is
Yep.
super cool.
I think the curiosity is a key part to all of this. And I was thinking about Dr. Bruce Perry's work. I just listened to an interview with him on 10% Happier and did a couple little segments on my YouTube channel. And he, that book is like, what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. Like that, just changing sort of how we're looking at students,
Right.
and ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
ourselves. Like we bring everything, all our past and our experiences into that classroom. So we get triggered by these things that we're triggering for us. Educators are so hard on themselves. I mean, when it's time to go to sleep at night, all we think about is everything we kind of did wrong, all the kids we didn't reach. And one of the things that Deb Dana taught me that I loved was this whole glimmer approach. So at the end of the day, asking the students to share one glimmer, one thing that was beautiful, that went well, that just kind of inspired them in the day. And it's a lovely way to end the day so that you leave going, oh, even this child over here that you thought had a really rough day had a glimmer to share.
Right.
And she's found that if they go to the bus and they've forgotten to share it, one of the students said to her, we didn't do our glimmers today. And so they were like saying their glimmers on the way to the bus. And one student said her glimmer was glimmers.
Oh,
Yes, yes. But about like polyvagal stuff and Deb and what you're doing and like all of it, again, sort of this like I don't like to introduce a negative without a positive, and it's like glimmers being like I remember Deb once saying like glimmers are the opposite of triggers. Like we all know what triggers are, they sort of set us off, but what are the glimmers of safety? What are the glimmers of hope? What are the glimmers in our surroundings? What are the glimmers? And I ask this of educators. I say, like, what are the glimmers, you're putting in your classroom to make kids feel seen? Like, is there a book that looks like every kid in your classroom? Are there posters that look like them? Like, what's your tone of voice? What are the, like, what glimmer are you giving each child each day when you can? Like, what are the glimmers in the hallway? Like, all of these things I feel like are such a useful language because we do, and it's wired into us. It's biological negativity bias. We look for the danger, we look for the negative, we focus on our own faults rather than our successes. But in the 21st century, we need to deliberately override that by looking for glimmers and by installing glimmers for these kids and for ourselves of what inspires us. Yeah.
Yeah, and as a staff, even, I think
Mm.
we get really mired in everything that's not working.
Yes.
When we have a staff meeting, it all comes down to
Oh,
everybody just starts unloading in every direction.
yeah.
And the
I mean,
poor
it's why I
principal.
quit being an educator or like in the building full-time educator and went to consulting because it was like, I mean, we've all been in those staff meetings where it's like, this kid's not doing this and this parent hasn't called me back. And I share this story oftentimes in my work of this one agency where I worked. We were working in like inner city Boston, like really challenging, multi-traumatized population. And we'd come back every Friday and be exhausted. And before we began the like, this kid hasn't done this and this kid hasn't done that, like we would go around and be like, what's working? Share one success. And now we might call that a glimmer. But like, oh, this kid made it to school 3 days in a row. This kid didn't get arrested this week. I mean, sometimes it's like that's the level, right? Of like how we want to look for the positive. And sometimes it's like, this kid got all A's or this kid did whatever. But sometimes it's like this kid showed up for the first time in 3 weeks. Like, and when we do that, it just then it's like we have just as much to learn from our successes as our failures or our challenges, and yet we forget as individuals to do that. And then if we can build that into the rituals, that our rituals themselves are a glimmer, right? Trauma happens when things are unpredictable. We make rituals, we make routines, we give predictability, and then we make trauma less likely to happen, right? Truly, right? But we have rituals in our community and our subcultures, right? And then that's part of the ritual is let's look for glimmers as the staff as well as the kids. I feel like that changes. And I think that's why that job didn't burn me out as fast as some other jobs did, because we would also talk about what was working and doing those, call-ins and not, shout outs and not just call outs, sort of like, this person helped me this week and Deb really inspired me and, Leanna gave me a really great idea, and kind of, calling out the positive in each other as well as in the kids, and having that parallel process is so important.
Dana talks about befriending your nervous system. You have attend and befriend. And so I think of it as a befriending school culture. Is it possible for us to actually start using that? Like, let's have a befriending school culture where everyone understands their nervous system states and each other, they know to look for it. They're doing some of the notice and naming of those states. They're practicing, as best as we can, the mindfulness. That term in itself feels doable. Like, I don't know, I don't like the term befriending. It just felt like I was very critical of my nervous system and understanding myself. But when I heard that term, I was like, oh, like befriend myself. That's interesting. That's critical parent in me, the critical voice in me.
It's interesting, Deborah, because I think you bring up a real solid point here, and Chris, you and I've had conversations again about these concepts, but that language really shapes our experiences. And I often say we can't change our perspective unless our perception shifts. And that perception comes through those experiences of attending and befriending, through being able to talk about the glimmers and understand what they mean to our autonomic nervous system. Having that language and those experiences and understanding shapes our experiences, and then that influences how we see the world and how we see ourselves in the world, how we show up. And so that concept right there is so profound for the teacher's nervous system, for the child's nervous system, and the ecosystem around them.
Mm-hmm. And that like common, my friend Sarah King talks about the nervous system of the collective nervous system, I think is her term. I've heard other people use that term as well, but I
Yeah.
think that's, and especially in a school, it can get so negative so fast and so toxic so fast. And so kind of like that sort of culture of martyrdom or that culture of complaining, and how do we keep that corrosive cynicism at bay?
Mm.
I think is really hard to do. It's really hard. It's hard, and it's a lot of responsibility as an individual. It's a lot of responsibility as a leader to try to keep it positive without shaming everybody into like putting on a happy face every day. And it's hard work, I think I want to emphasize too.
There's a YouTube channel, it's called Teacher Therapy, and I was interviewed on that one. And it's all the whole channel is about teachers quitting.
Mm.
So all it is teachers in these interviews talking about all the reasons why they quit. So I went on trying to sort of shift it a little bit into, so I went in on and shared a little bit about the repair continuum. Leanna and I kind of came up with this idea of this rupture and repair. It's
Mm,
really common, right? That terminology. But we ended up with like miss and mends are those little things in the classroom that we're capable of handling on a moment to moment daily basis, no problem. But then as the continuum, we go into rupture and repair, that becomes where we need a behavior team. We need more support. It's behavior that's beyond where we are, being able in our skill set. And then we have breach and builds, which is where the trust is totally gone at that point. We've been threatened, violently, or a parent's threatened to hurt us or something like that. Like that's a breach. That's where you have to bring in community, possibly police show up. I mean, that sort
mm,
of thing. When I was on the teacher therapy talk, I said, what's happening is teachers are handling too much of the ruptures and the breaches. We need to kind of stick to the miss and mends. And I think we can be more present and more mindful and more of all these things we're talking about. If we know we have support, one of the forms in the book too is how many misses and mends have you handled today? How many
mm,
ruptures and repairs, and how many breaches?
yeah,
And that's different to everybody's nervous system. What would be a miss and mend to me might be a rupture and repair to somebody else. But for your nervous system, how many of these? And then I think when the teachers come together and they start seeing, now the administration can say, oh, I think we need more support with these
mhm,
ruptures. And that language, again, what you were talking about, Leanna, having that language, if we could use those, like what level of danger that is to my nervous system, and how then I disconnect, and I can't be compassionate, and I can't be all these things that we want to be because we've moved into danger, we've moved into disconnection. So that I shared that, and teachers are really understanding that a little bit more, that when does support needed? Because I think if we have the support built in already, it's set up. Oh, when you're feeling like you're moving on this continuum into this middle part where you're feeling much more danger, getting more cues of danger, now we bring in, you, the behavior team, Leanna, the social worker. Like that's what I think is missing. If I knew I didn't need to handle it alone.
right,
I think that's the challenge. So many teachers are handling this really difficult behavior alone.
yeah,
And yet they're asking themselves or expecting themselves to be compassionate and mindful. And they're just, they're scared. Some of them
right,
are scared of some of these kids in the classroom.
Teachers need to be witnessed. That's why I think it's so important for the teachers co-regulating each other,
yeah,
because it's kind of like how can I offer something that I really haven't been able to be open to or to receive, or maybe not had the opportunity to even have it offered. And so I think that for teachers, my question would be, who's able to witness you?
yeah. And I think reflect back that kind of unconditional positive regard too. I feel like, you know, a school is a hierarchy. It's about, kind of different, rating scales and judgments of the kids and how they're performing. And of course that trickles up. And of course there needs to be accountability for teachers too. But it's like everyone's always being judged in that environment, judged socially, right? This kid's cool, this kid's not cool, this kid's smart, this kid's not, right? And that trickles up to the teachers as well. And so I think being aware of that, I think one thing I love about that, I am a therapist who works with educators often, is that I'll say, like, I learned more about managing a group of kids from educators than I learned in any group therapy course I did in graduate school. And like, I hope teachers can learn too from me about self-regulation, co-regulation, transference, countertransference, these other kinds of things as well, that we can talk to each other about. And what I really also appreciate, that you're bringing in are these sort of different levels of that everyone has different sort of levels of, like, what's I'm writing down here, right? Was it like, miss and mend versus a breach and repair, and that's okay, that's sort of different for each of us. But that's when we can come together and support each other. That would be a breach for me. Maybe it's more of a mend for you. Here's how I would mend that. Here's how I would repair it. Like, it's just really helpful too, and not kind of over dramatizing, but also coming together. We're all experiencing this. None of us is perfect either. And then also figuring out how can we, again, build this culture. I vividly remember whenever you start getting number grades, and it's like getting getting an 80 on a test and being like, but 80% is a lot of percent. Like, that's most of it. Like, why is that a bad grade? Like, I got most of it right. Like, and yet it is sort of like this really, it's like, this sort of expectation on perfection in these different ways too. And then teachers, I think, so much getting it from parents and from administrators and from the kids and from, as you're saying, Leanna, too, like their own children and their own aging parents, and being so sandwiched in there. And then how to have a positive peer community that's not just sort of one of griping, but one of validation and seeing each other and seeing the suffering and problem solving through that as well. I feel like is so important that we figure out how to do that for each other as educators, and create spaces where educators feel safe enough to open up around that stuff too, I think is important.
When I was doing my research, I was, it's all about disgruntled teachers and the numbers quitting. And I thought, well, where are the happy teachers? Like, what makes happy teachers? So I started going into that direction on the research. I started pulling up articles on happy teachers, and it really comes down to, it's kind of simple. They have co-regulating partners. They have collaborative experiences.
There you go.
They have a friend who has their back. They came to school feeling like they had that support of others. They weren't in it alone. I think the teacher who's going to be most likely to quit is the one who just goes in her classroom, shuts the door, and tries to do it alone.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that I've learned through polyvagal and talking with Deb Dana, is I've always thought of myself as self-reliant and independent. And when you grow up in certain kinds of homes, you become very self-reliant and very independent. So to ask for help for me was always a sign of weakness. And I realized that to ask for help is actually a sign of strength. You've listened to your nervous system and you've said, I can't do this alone anymore. I need to find some support and some help. And I think sometimes in schools, if teachers or support staff, I have a lot of in our community, our OTs and PTs, and they feel like if they ask for help from their supervisor, ask for help from their principal, they're going to be seen as weak. And I think we need to understand that the nervous system is a co-regulating system. It wants to go find help and resources and talk with somebody about what's going on. It's the natural state of things. I mean, teachers feel like, oh, if I go in there, I'm going to be seen as not a very good classroom manager. We have to bust that myth.
Right.
Yes.
And that the principals themselves are under pressures, political pressures and stuff like that. And they need space to say, hang on, I need a breath. Like, this is coming at me from 5 directions too, and build like teacher administrator empathy, teacher student empathy, parent to teacher empathy, vice versa, like start to open up some of these pathways where there's been some closed, like literally closed doors, and closed hearts. I remember being in education, being like, "Oh, can't go ask for help. The door's closed with in the principal or the assistant principal's office." I guess but that sends a message, right?
Right.
And kind of how to open everybody and to be. This actually just came up again. I keep referring to this last client I spoke to last hour, but he was talking about isolated versus insulated being different concepts, and I think too about, in the mindfulness world, we talk a lot about independence versus interdependence, right? That it's like in America, we really value independence, and yet it's very isolating. But that learning how to co-regulate in healthy ways as a community, like in peer groups, and in, sort of both top down and bottom up, and, kind of across these sort of different hierarchies that are, within a school system or a community, I think are really important. To figure out how we do that and build more compassion and connection and co-regulation between those.
What do you say to a teacher who I was listening to an interview, and one teacher said, if I hear the word compassion one more time, there's a culture right now building on the, YouTube and social media creates environments and creates cultures. And so this culture that's building is compassion equals no boundaries for kids, no responsibility for their behavior, give
Yeah.
them a candy bar, and send them back to class. And
Yeah.
that's a culture that's building, and it's kind of growing. So I'm sort of trying to figure out, what is our response to that?
Yeah, I mean, and I feel like compassion is boundary. Like compassion is also boundaries. Like setting a firm boundary is compassionate to me and it's compassionate to you. Like because then you're learning, in a sense, how the world works, and you're learning also like where you end and other people begin, and where your responsibility ends and where other people's begins, and where you can grow into, what's the podcast? We Can Do Hard Things. Like I just love the title of it. It's like, yeah, this is really hard and we can do it. And sort of it's this both and I feel like this comes up a lot in my work consulting in schools, and sort of like, we need accommodations for kids that are anxious, but it can't be, you don't have to go to class. Like it needs to be like, what can we do to help you stay in class? Let's start with you going to class and then figure out how long you can stay. Not let's start with you not in class and then figure out, how to get you to class. Like, again, that feels very old-fashioned, and it's not, hard and fast rule of mine, but I do feel like we're in this really tricky situation where we are, confusing compassion with sort of a lack of responsibility, and that line is always going to change across cultures, across aspects of society. But I think we've swung in a direction that has been not so helpful for a lot of kids, and learning how and where we, start to help kids see how much more they are capable of than they might realize, I think is really important. That they can hold themselves to a standard of like, oh, I was able to stay in class today. I was able to manage my behavior and these different things, and I can learn how to take responsibility. And it's really hard. I don't want to go back to all punishment by any means, but it's like where it's really hard. There's been more of a cultural conversation around boundaries, and I think one that's very much needs to happen, I think in general, but I think that needs to happen particularly in education, where I think, there is that sort of like badge of honor about whose car is the last one to leave the parking lot and that kind of thing. And that's in psychotherapy world as well. Sort of like who has the worst boundaries is like making the biggest
Gets rewarded.
sacrifice, and it's not helpful at a certain point. And that's a privilege, as like a white dude, that's a pretty privileged thing to say. I think it's more complex for different groups of people than it is for me, but I just want to acknowledge that too.
This will be a quote I will use forever, Chris. Compassion is boundaried. I've never heard that before. Compassion always seems so, right? Just so, and I love that aspect that it's boundaried.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just bringing all of this back to how we grow through what we go through, which I think is a really cool title. All that we talked about today is helping us when there is trauma, when something has happened. I like what you said at the very beginning, that there's no pressure around, but you must grow.
I often get asked the question, or used to more, now I kind of speak to it directly. They were like, all right, when am I going to be in post-traumatic growth? As if like it was linear, like, okay, have I done enough healing? You heal and grow at the same time. It's
Right.
not
Yeah.
linear, one
Yeah.
then the next.
Right.
Right?
It's both and you're already
Both
there.
and.
And that's why all it can do is create the conditions for people, not tell them, because they may not be at that moment of blossoming. It's like you can't force a flower open to blossom, right? Keep watering it, keep fertilizing it, and hope that it blossoms one day.